The rope marks on her wrists had faded by the time anyone thought to look. 4 years. 4 years in the town of Harlan's Creek, Utah, and not a single soul had knocked on that door to ask if Isolde Mercer was still breathing. She had been 18 years old when her uncle sold her. That was the only honest word for it. Her father was 3 months in the ground, her mother gone long before that, and her uncle, Prentice Holt, had debts that outpaced his shame by a considerable margin. When Garrett Mercer came calling with a folded banker's note and a gold watch he wore specifically to impress men who could be impressed by such things, Prentice had shaken the man's hand before Isolde had finished clearing the supper dishes. Garrett Mercer was 41 years old. He owned the only grain mill in Harlan's Creek, the warehouse beside the rail depot, and approximately half of the dry goods credit in the surrounding county. He was not a large man. He was compact, sharp-edged, with thin, colorless lips and pale eyes that missed nothing and forgave nothing. On their wedding day, he had worn a gray suit with a carnation pinned to the lapel, and the Reverend Aldous Fitch had read from Ephesians about wives submitting to their husbands as if delivering a legal judgment. Isolde had stood at that altar in a borrowed dress, 2 sizes too large, and told herself it was a partnership. A transaction, yes, but one with terms she could learn to live inside. She learned the terms on the 3rd night of their marriage when she burned the gravy. It hadn't been a slap. Garrett Mercer was not a man who slapped. He grabbed her by the back of the neck, walked her to the iron stove, and held her hand 6 inches above the burner, just long enough, just until she understood. "I do not eat burnt food," he said, releasing her. "We will not have this conversation again." They never did have that conversation again, but they had others. Over the following 4 years, Isolde learned to read Garrett Mercer the way a sailor reads weather, the particular set of his jaw when a business arrangement went sideways, the way his footsteps changed on the porch stairs when he'd been drinking the rye he kept in the bottom drawer of his roll-top desk, the sound his belt buckle made when his fingers found it in the dark. She learned which bruises could be covered with a high collar, and which required a story. She learned to laugh at church socials, a specific laugh, bright and hollow as a gourd, the laugh of a woman with no complaints. She learned that Dorinda Fitch, the Reverend's wife, had watched her climb the church steps one February Sunday, moving like a woman 30 years older, and had looked away before their eyes could meet. The town of Harlan's Creek was not a cruel place, exactly. It was something worse. It was a practical place. Garrett Mercer employed 11 men directly and held notes on the property of 6 more. He sat on the town council. He donated the new pump to the schoolhouse. He was, by every visible measure, a pillar. Pillars, Isolde had come to understand, don't get questioned, they get worked around. The only person who had ever acknowledged the truth was Beulah Sharp, the woman who did the laundry for 4 of the wealthier households on the north side of town. Beulah was 70 years old, half-deaf, and had seen enough of the world to have stopped pretending. One afternoon in Isolde's 2nd year, she had taken the sheets from Isolde's arms, looked at the dried blood on the pillowcase, and said simply, "Child, I am sorry." Then she had folded the sheet over, hiding it, and that was all. That was the entirety of Harlan's Creek's mercy. The breaking point came on an evening in late October. The rail company had sent a letter. One of Garrett's warehouse contracts had been awarded, instead to an outfit out of Provo, a decision that cost him considerably and that he received quietly, in the manner of a man storing an injury rather than expressing it. Isolde had known by supper time. She had sent their hired girl, a young Paiute woman named Essa, home early. She had moved through the kitchen mechanically, preparing the meal with the focused precision of a person diffusing something. It wasn't enough. She still did not know what, specifically, she had done or failed to do. Later she would decide it hadn't mattered. She had simply been the nearest available thing. He hit her with the flat of his hand across the left ear, and the world became a long, high ringing, like a bell struck too hard. She stumbled into the corner cabinet. The second blow caught her across the shoulder and drove her to the kitchen floor. She had learned, over 4 years, not to put her hands up. Hands up made it worse. She had learned to make herself very small, very still, and wait for the weather to pass. But this night the weather did not pass. He dragged her up by her hair and told her, in a voice so quiet and reasonable it was somehow more frightening than shouting, that she was a burden and a disappointment, and that she had been both since the first week of their marriage. He said he had given her uncle a considerable sum of money for a wife who could manage a household, and that he had been cheated in this arrangement as in so many others. He walked her backward into the parlor wall. She felt the plaster crack against her shoulder blades. The last thing she clearly remembered before the darkness took her was the sound of the front window rattling in the wind, and the strange distant thought that it had started to snow. It had indeed started to snow. Up in the Wasatch Range, above the tree line where the junipers gave out, and the granite faces ran sheer and white against the sky, a man named Declan Crow was making poor time. He was a large man, though the word large did not quite cover it. He stood several inches above 6 feet, and was built in the manner of someone who had spent the better part of 2 decades hauling freight, trapping, and surviving in country that killed the underprepared with cheerful indifference. His coat was elk-hide, his boots were double-soled, and the pack mule he was leading was named Contrition, a name the animal had earned. He had been coming down from a 6-month stretch in the high country, making for Cedar City to sell a season's worth of pelts, when the early snowstorm had cut off his southern pass. He detested towns. Declan Crow had grown up in the hill country of eastern Tennessee before the war made the hills mean, and the meanness outran the hills. He had come west afterward, looking for space, and he had found it, and he had arranged his life carefully to minimize the amount of time he spent in the company of people who lived behind fences and called it civilization. He found that civilization, viewed up close, was mostly just the same cruelties dressed in better fabric. Harlan's Creek was the nearest settlement. He had been to it twice before, both times briefly, both times for powder and coffee and nothing else. He tied Contrition at the livery and pressed into the wind, his head down, his boots punching through the crust of new snow on the main street. He was thinking about whether the saloon would object to a man sleeping in a chair until the pass cleared when he heard the sound from the house on the corner of Millbrook and 2nd. He stopped. It was a woman's voice, low and involuntary, the sound a person makes when pain breaks through their control before they can swallow it back. He had heard that sound before. He had heard it in field hospitals during the war. He had heard it from animals in traps. He looked at the house. It was a solid 2-story, well-maintained, expensive curtains visible through the frosted glass. A respectable house. The lights were on in the parlor. He looked up and down the street. There was a man on the porch, 2 houses down, half hidden in the shadow of his doorway, smoking a pipe and looking in the opposite direction with the studied deliberateness of someone who has decided not to see a thing. Declan stood in the snow for a moment. He was not by nature an interfering man. He had learned in the war that interfering cost more than it returned, that other people's situations were rarely what they looked like, and that justice, as a concept, was mostly decorative. He had spent 15 years arranging his life around this understanding. Then the sound came again. He walked to the front door of the Mercer house and knocked twice, hard. There was a silence. Then Garrett Mercer opened the door. He was a compact man with pale eyes, and he looked at the enormous snow-covered figure on his porch with the expression of a man who had not expected this and was rapidly calculating how to manage it. His right hand, Declan noticed, was slightly swollen across the knuckles. "Evening," Mercer said. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with your wife," Declan said. Something moved behind Garrett Mercer's eyes. "My wife is unwell. This isn't a good time." "I imagine not," Declan said. He had not raised his voice. He had not moved. He was simply standing in the doorway, taking up most of it, and looking at Garrett Mercer with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who has tracked things across considerable distances and knows how to wait. "You need to leave my property," Mercer said, and his voice had dropped into the register of a man accustomed to having the last word. "I need to see your wife," Declan said again. "You can step aside, or I can step you aside. I'm comfortable either way." Mercer reached for the door to close it. He didn't get it closed. What happened next was not a long fight. Garrett Mercer was not a small man, and he was not without nerve, but he had built his sense of power on money and position and locked doors, and none of those things were available to him at this particular moment. Declan caught the door with one hand and Garrett's collar with the other, walked him backward 3 steps, and sat him down hard against the parlor wall. Not violently, exactly, purposefully. The way you set down something you intend to keep track of. "Sit there," Declan said. Mercer sat. His face was the color of old chalk. Whatever he saw in Declan Crow's expression had bypassed his calculations entirely. Declan found Isolde on the kitchen floor. She was conscious, barely, sitting with her back against the lower cabinet and her knees drawn up, her left eye swollen nearly shut, her bottom lip split and bleeding. She was holding herself very still in the way of a person who has learned that stillness is safer than movement. When she heard his boots on the kitchen floor, she pulled her arms up around her head. "No," Declan said, and crouched down to her level. His voice had changed entirely from the one he'd used in the parlor. It dropped to something low and quiet, stripped of everything but its honest intent. "I'm not him. Look at me." It took her a moment. Then she lowered her arms, 1 degree at a time, and looked. "Can you stand?" he asked. She thought about it. "Yes." "Then we need to go." "Do you have a coat?" She stared at him. The question seemed to reach her from a very long distance. "Why are you here?" "I heard you," he said simply. "Coat." She made it to her feet on her own, which he let her do, understanding somehow that she needed to. She took her coat from the hook by the back door with hands that shook only slightly. He watched her button it, and there was something in the carefulness of the gesture, the determined small dignity of it, that settled something in his chest, like a weight finding its proper place. They came back through the parlor. Garrett Mercer was still against the wall. He had recovered enough to manufacture indignation. "You have no legal right," he said. "She is my wife. This is my house. I'll have the sheriff on you by morning." "That's fine," Declan said. "She has nowhere to go," Garrett said, and now there was something uglier in it, something satisfied. "She has no money, no family, no one in this town who'll take her in. You walk her out that door and she's finished. She knows that." Declan looked at him for a long moment. "You held a woman down for 4 years using other people's cowardice as your weapon," he said. "I want you to sit with that the rest of your life and understand what it says about what you actually are." He walked Isolde out the front door and into the snow. She had lived for 4 years in a town that heard her and looked away. She had walked its streets, sat in its church, smiled at its social functions, and watched its people carefully arrange themselves so as not to witness her. Now she walked out of it in the dark and the snow, and she did not look back at a single light in a single window. They were half a block from the livery when they heard the boots behind them. Deputy Sheriff Court Winslow was 24 years old and constitutionally unsuited to conflict, but he had a badge and a reputation to consider, and someone had seen the big stranger walking a woman out of the Mercer house and told Sheriff Briggs, who had sent Winslow because Briggs himself had decided it was too cold. "Hold up there," Winslow called. His voice cracked on the second word. Declan stopped. He turned around. Winslow was holding a lantern in one hand and had his other hand hovering near his holster in a way that suggested he had not decided yet whether to commit to the gesture. "That woman is the legal property, the legal wife, of Garrett Mercer," Winslow said. "You can't just walk off with somebody's wife, mister." "Where was your badge?" Declan said. "The last 4 years." The deputy's lantern bobbed in the wind. Winslow looked at Isolde's face, lit orange in the lantern light, the swollen eye, the split lip, the bruise spreading purple across her cheekbone, and for just a moment the young deputy looked genuinely stricken. Then he looked back at Declan. "I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, but the authority had gone out of it. "No," Declan said. "You're going to go back and tell Sheriff Briggs that Garrett Mercer beat his wife bloody tonight and that I removed her from the situation. You're going to tell him that if anyone comes up that mountain after us, I will know, and I will not be the one coming down again." He paused. "And you're going to have to make your peace, deputy, with the part you played in this, starting tonight." Winslow stood in the snow for a long moment. He stepped aside. Declan untied Contrition from the livery post, and they left Harlan's Creek on foot, Isolde walking beside him, with the rigid, effortful gait of someone running on will alone, the mule plodding behind them, and the town of Harlan's Creek receding in the white dark until it was nothing at all. She did not cry until they had been walking for nearly 2 hours, not from grief and not from pain, though both were present. She cried from something closer to bewilderment, the weeping of a person who has been clenched so long they have forgotten what it felt like to unclench, and finds the unclenching harder than the clenching ever was. Declan did not tell her to stop. He did not say it would be all right. He said nothing at all, which was the right thing, and they walked on into the dark. His winter camp was a log structure built against a south-facing cliff wall at roughly 7,000 feet, accessible by a trail that would not have been obvious to anyone who didn't already know it was there. He had built it over 3 seasons from materials the mountain provided, and it was tight and warm, and smelled of pine resin and dried sage, and the particular clean, cold scent of high altitude. He laid a fire, he heated water, he cleaned the cut on her lip and the gash at her hairline, with the methodical gentleness of a man who had treated wounds in the field because there was no one else to do it, and who had come to understand that the manner of treatment mattered as much as the treatment itself. He splinted 2 fingers on her left hand that were broken, or at minimum severely sprained. He did all of this without commentary, and without asking her to explain anything. She watched him from beneath a wool blanket, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of spruce needle tea, and said, "You live up here alone. Yes, by choice, yes." She was quiet for a while. The fire snapped. Outside, the wind had found the ridge and was making itself known. "Why did you come down to town tonight?" "Storm blocked my path south," he said. "I was looking for a place to wait it out, and you found me instead." He looked up from what he was doing. His eyes were a dark, weathered gray, the eyes of a man who spent most of his time looking at distances. "I heard you," he said, "and no one else was doing anything about it." She looked at him for a long time. "What happens now?" she said. "You rest," he said. "After that, we figure out the rest." The winter at Elevation was not gentle, but it was honest. There was no hidden cruelty in the cold. It did not pretend to be something else. It simply was what it was, and once Isolde understood that, she found she could work with it. Her broken fingers healed. The bruises went through their full chromatic cycle and faded. She slept at first, with the particular vigilance of a woman who had spent 4 years never fully sleeping, coming bolt upright at sounds in the night, her heart in her throat. Declan made no comment on this. He simply went back to sleep himself, calmly, until she understood that the sounds in the night up here were only the mountain conducting its own business. She began to be useful. She learned to keep the fire properly, to read the color of the wood smoke, to pack snow into the smelting barrel for water. Declan taught her to set a snare and to be patient afterward, which was its own lesson. He showed her where the spring came up under the east face, still running even in February, and how to read the sky for the kind of weather that required staying inside versus the kind that merely required dressing for. They talked in the evenings, not constantly, not the kind of talking that papers over silence. Real talking, the kind that happens when 2 people are engaged in the same work, and honesty is more efficient than pretense. She told him about her father, who had been a decent man brought low by a bad winter, and a weaker character than he'd known he had. She told him about Prentice and the handshake over the supper dishes. She told him about Beulah Sharp and the folded sheet, which was the closest thing to kindness the town had managed. He told her about the war, briefly and without drama, the way people describe things that are finished and can't be changed. He told her about the mountains at greater length and with something that might have been, in a less restrained man, enthusiasm. Between them, a thing grew that neither of them named, because naming it would have required a kind of confidence in the future that felt presumptuous given the circumstances. But it was there. It had the quality of the spring under the east face, present and persistent, running even when the ground above it was frozen solid. She had been on the mountain for 3 months when Declan came back from checking the lower trap line with his jaw set and his eyes doing the calculation she had learned to recognize. "Someone's been on the lower trail," he said. He had found boot prints. 2 men, possibly 3, coming up from the south. The prints were not wandering. They were purposeful. She had known this was possible. She had known it from the first night, really. Garrett Mercer was not a man who absorbed a loss gracefully. He was a man who held notes and called them in. "He'll want me back," she said. "Not a question. Or he'll want it to look like he did everything a man's supposed to do," Declan said. "Whether he actually wants you back, I wouldn't venture to guess." "What do we do?" He looked at her. In the months since that first night, she had changed in ways that were not superficial. The hollow, flinching quality was gone from her. It had been replaced by something that was not hardness exactly, but was adjacent to it. She stood differently. She spoke differently. She had a way now of looking directly at a thing. "Up to you," he said. "We can move higher, up to the Box Canyon camp. Lose them in the snowfields, or we can meet it." She considered this. She thought about 4 years of waiting for it to be over. She thought about Beulah Sharp's careful folding. She thought about Deputy Winslow stepping aside in the snow. "I'm not moving higher," she said. "I'm done retreating." He nodded once, as though this was what he had expected. He taught her to shoot that winter, or rather, he refined what she had already partially taught herself. She had handled her father's rifle as a girl and retained the basics. What she needed was precision and, more than that, nerve. The ability to hold still when everything in her instincts screamed movement. She learned this the hard way, in the cold, shooting at marks on the rock face, until her hands were steady even when the rest of her wasn't. They came on a Tuesday in late March, 4 days after the boot prints. 2 men Isolde did not recognize, hired out of somewhere south, cold-eyed professionals who wore their business plainly, and behind them, riding a horse that was too fine for the altitude, Garrett Mercer. He looked different up here, smaller. His expensive coat was wrong for the country, his color bad, his certainty the artificial kind that men carry into situations they haven't properly assessed. He had hired the men from a distance and told himself that made him safe. Declan met them at the tree line. Isolde was behind him, and to the right, on higher ground, with the rifle she'd been shooting for 2 months, and her back against a granite face that offered no approach from the rear. "That's far enough," Declan said. Garrett Mercer pulled his horse up. He looked at Declan with the expression he reserved for problems that needed to be explained to someone too obtuse to understand them. "That woman is my wife," he said. "I have a legal warrant. I'm taking her home." "Show me the warrant," Declan said. Mercer nodded to one of the hired men, who reached inside his coat. Declan watched the hand. "Slowly," Declan said. The man produced a paper. Declan didn't look at it. "She's not going with you," Declan said. "I want you to look at this mountain, and I want you to understand that you're standing on my ground, not yours. There are no deeds up here, there are no notes. There is no council, there is nothing up here that you own or control or can call to your side." Garrett's composure had a crack in it now. "You are harboring my wife against the law. I'll see you hang for this." "You'll have a hard time getting a jury together," Declan said. "Once the county gets the full accounting of what happened to her over 4 years, while your sheriff looked the other way. The hired man on the left shifted his weight. From her position on the higher ground, Isolde put the front sight of the rifle on him and breathed out, slow and even, the way she'd practiced. Garrett Mercer looked up at her. She met his gaze without flinching, without the hollowness, without any of the things he had spent 4 years carefully installing in her. She simply looked at him, and what he saw there was enough. "I want you to leave," Isolde said. Her voice was clear and level, and carried on the thin mountain air without effort. "I want you to go back down this mountain and tell anyone who asks that Isolde Mercer is dead. I am dead to Harlan's Creek. I am dead to you. You go back to your grain mill and your warehouse and your council seat, and you tell yourself whatever story makes it possible for you to sleep." "And if I don't?" Garrett said. "Then I've been practicing for 2 months," she said, "and you'll find I'm a better shot than I used to be." It was not, in the end, the rifle that moved him. It was her face. He had spent 4 years arranging that face into the shape he wanted, and the woman looking down at him from the granite slope was not wearing it anymore, had no intention of ever wearing it again, and the knowledge of this moved through Garrett Mercer like cold water, and left behind it something that might, in a better man, have been shame. He turned his horse. The hired men, relieved, followed without a word. She watched them until the tree line closed behind them. Then she climbed down from the granite face and stood in the snow of the mountain clearing, the rifle hanging loose at her side, the spring wind coming up through the pines. She had spent 4 years waiting for someone to come, for the law, for a neighbor, for anyone who might stand in a doorway and say, "This is not right, and now I am going to do something about it." No one had come. The town had calculated its interests and turned away, and she had almost died inside that calculation. But the mountain made no such calculation. The mountain simply was, stone and sky and cold, and the absolute democratic indifference of altitude. And she had learned over the winter that she was not smaller than it. She was made of something that could withstand it. She had not known that before. She knew it now. They stayed through the spring thaw, then through the summer, with its brief, violent wildflower season, and its afternoon lightning storms that rolled up from the south like something with intentions. Declan taught her the high trails, and she taught him, without meaning to, that a person could be known completely and still be treated as someone worth knowing. Harlan's Creek did not come for them again. Years later, there would be rumors. Travelers crossing the Wasatch Range sometimes reported smoke from a cabin above the tree line, or a flash of something, a figure in elk hide, or a woman with sun-dark forearms and a rifle slung across her back, glimpsed at the edge of the high meadows, and gone before they could be certain of what they'd seen. They were never certain, but the mountain knew. The mountain had seen a woman arrive at its feet more ghost than person, hollowed out by years of careful, systematic destruction, and had watched her walk up into it, step by step through the cold and the dark, and come out the other side into something clean. No cage, however well built, holds past the point when the one inside it stops believing in the walls. Isolde Mercer had stopped believing in the walls.